Some stories are etched in gunfire and gold tales of legendary outlaws and iron-willed lawmen. But this is not one of them. This story is carved into the parched earth of the Arizona Territory, a tale of quiet courage that roared louder than any cult peacemaker. It's about a girl the world had forgotten, a young woman named Lydia Mayhew, who possessed nothing but a knowledge of roots and herbs, and a heart less calloused than the land around her. On a day that began like any other, under the oppressive glare of the sun, she would make a choice that would save 2 lives, and in doing so, place an entire town on the brink of a war it could not win. What followed was a decision from a powerful chief, so shocking, so utterly world-altering, that it would forever redefine the meaning of debt justice and power in the wild, untamed West. Lydia Mayhew existed in the margins, a ghost haunting the edges of Redemption Gulch. The town, a blister of clapboard and sin, baked onto the Arizona landscape, had a long memory and a short supply of charity. Lydia was the living legacy of both. Her parents, hopeful prospectors, had been taken by the fever a decade prior, leaving their 15-year-old daughter with nothing but a rickety shack on the town's periphery and a reputation as tainted as brackish water. They had been outcasts, dreamers who spoke too softly and trusted too easily, and the town had inherited its disdain for them and passed it down to their lone offspring. Now 25, Lydia had honed survival into a quiet art form. She was a slip of a thing, with sun-bleached hair that was more straw than gold, and eyes the color of a faded prairie sky. Her hands, though slender, were a roadmap of hard work, calloused from digging for roots, and stained with the juices of berries and herbs. This was her trade, her only coin in a world that dealt in silver and lead. The townspeople might scorn her, but they couldn't deny the efficacy of her remedies. Mrs. Gable would send her boy for a poultice, for her husband's bad back, always under the cloak of twilight. Even Sheriff Barton, a man whose heart seemed to be carved from petrified wood, had once dispatched a deputy for a tincture to soothe his agonizing toothache. They paid her in scraps a half-full sack of flour, a few wrinkled potatoes, a worn-out blanket, never enough to thrive, only enough to persist. Her home was a testament to her station. The shack leaned against the prevailing wind, its timbers groaning like an old man's bones. Inside, bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the single room with a complex, earthy perfume, the sharp scent of yarrow, the sweet breath of chamomile, and the bitter tang of wormwood. This was her sanctuary, the only place she wasn't met with suspicious glares, or the cruel, whispered moniker, the hedge witch of the Gulch. On this particular day, the sun was a malevolent god, beating down on the land with a fury that cracked the earth and drove all sensible creatures into the shade. Lydia was miles from town, her worn leather satchel slung over her shoulder. She was searching for bishop's weed, a stubborn plant that grew only in the rocky, shaded crevices of the Sunstone Canyons, a treacherous maze of red rock that was considered the unofficial border of Apache territory. The townsfolk wouldn't dare venture this far. They saw the canyons as a place of death home to rattlesnakes, mountain lions, and the silent, ever-present threat of the tribe that claimed these lands as their ancestral home. Lydia, however, felt a strange peace here. The silence was cleaner than the town's judgmental whispers. The towering sentinels of sandstone didn't stare. They simply stood, ancient and indifferent. She moved with a practiced ease, her eyes scanning the ground, her steps light. It was in a narrow wash, where the shadows lay thick and cool, that she found it. Not the herb she was looking for, but something else entirely. At first it was the color that caught her eye, a splash of deep crimson against the ochre dust. It was blood. A lot of it. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the canyon silence. Her first instinct, the one screamed by years of ingrained caution, was to turn and flee back to the dubious safety of her shack. But a sound stopped her, a low groan of such profound pain that it transcended language and spoke directly to the healer's instinct buried deep within her. She followed the sound around a large boulder, her breath catching in her throat. Sprawled in the dust were two figures, both women, and they were unlike any she had ever seen up close. They were Apache, that much was clear from their buckskin clothing and the intricate beadwork on their moccasins. But it was their size that was so staggering. They were giants, both easily, a head taller than any man in Redemption Gulch, with broad shoulders and limbs corded with muscle. They were warriors, not women who spent their days grinding corn. One lay still, her face ashen, a crude, blood-soaked bandage wrapped around her thigh where the bone had clearly broken and pierced the skin. The other was propped on an elbow, a long, wicked-looking gash running from her temple down her cheek, her dark eyes glazed with pain and fever. A shattered rifle lay beside them, and the scene told a clear story, a fall. A bad one. They had likely been tracking game along the canyon rim when the treacherous rock gave way. The conscious woman's eyes snapped open as Lydia approached, and they burned with a fierce, cornered animal light. Her hand went to the knife at her belt, her fingers fumbling with the handle. A low, guttural warning rumbled in her chest. Lydia froze, holding her hands up, palms open, showing she was unarmed. Her satchel of herbs suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Every story she'd ever heard, every campfire tale of brutal massacres and scalpings screamed at her to run. The sheriff's words echoed in her mind. You see one of them, you don't ask questions. You ride or you shoot. But then she looked past the warrior's glare and into the face of the other sister. The woman's breathing was shallow, a ragged, wet sound that spoke of internal injuries. Her skin was clammy, and her life was clearly guttering like a cheap candle in a gale. Lydia saw not an Apache, not an enemy, but a person dying. And in that moment, the outcast of Redemption Gulch, the girl who had been shown so little compassion, found she could not simply walk away and leave another human being to the mercy of the vultures circling high overhead. She took a slow, deliberate step forward. I mean, you no harm, she said. Her voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to carry in the profound stillness of the canyon. I can help. The conscious warrior's eyes narrowed her knuckles, white on the hilt of her knife. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. For a long, terrifying moment, the fate of all three of them hung suspended in the shimmering heat. Lydia could run and save herself, or she could stay and risk everything for two people who the world would consider her mortal enemies. The sun beat down, the vultures circled, and Lydia Mayhew made her choice. The air in the narrow wash was thick with tension, a palpable thing that tasted of dust and fear. The Apache woman, her face, a mask of pain and suspicion, watched Lydia's every move. Her name, Lydia would later learn, was Nita. The unconscious one was her sister Kaya. But for now they were nameless, a warrior, and her dying charge. Lydia lowered herself to her knees, slowly, deliberately keeping her movement small and non-threatening. She unslung her satchel and opened it carefully, laying out its contents on a flat rock, bundles of dried leaves, small clay pots of salve, clean strips of linen, torn from old flour sacks, and her one precious tool, a small, sharp skinning knife. Nita's eyes followed the knife, a low growl forming in her throat again. For herbs, Lydia said softly, holding the knife up, and then using it to slice a piece of willow bark, demonstrating its purpose. only for herbs. She decided to focus on Kaya first. The leg wound was horrific, a compound fracture dirty and already showing the first angry red signs of infection. The crude bandage was soaked through, and the smell of blood was heavy in the air. Without immediate and proper care, the fever would consume her, and even if she survived that, she would lose the leg. For a warrior, that was a fate worse than death. Lydia knew what she had to do. She crawled closer, her gaze fixed on the wound, trying to project an aura of calm competence she was far from feeling. "I need water," she murmured, more to herself than to Nita. Her own canteen was nearly empty. Her eyes scanned the canyon floor, and spotting a patch of darker, damp-looking sand a few yards away, she knew there had to be a seep. She pointed to her canteen, then to the damp patch. Nita watched her expression unreadable. Taking a risk, Lydia stood and walked slowly to the spot, digging with her bare hands, until a small, muddy puddle of water began to form. It was slow, agonizing work under the warrior's intense scrutiny. She used a strip of linen to filter the gritty water into her canteen, a process she repeated a dozen times until she had enough. Returning to Kaya, she began the most dangerous part. She had to clean the wound. This would be excruciating, and she had no way to explain it to Nita. She looked at the conscious sister, her sky-blue eyes pleading for trust. She pointed to the wound, then to the clean water, and then made a gentle washing motion with her hands. Nita's gaze flickered between Lydia, her sister's mangled leg, and the knife on the rock. A silent, agonizing war was being waged behind her dark eyes. Finally, with a barely perceptible nod, she slumped back against the rock, her hand never leaving her own knife, but the immediate threat of violence seemed to recede. Lydia worked with a focus that blocked out everything else. She gently cut away the buckskin around the wound. Kaya moaned, her body twitching, but she didn't wake. Using the filtered water and a clean cloth, Lydia began to clean the wound, her touch as delicate as she could make it. She flushed out dirt and rock fragments her stomach, churning at the sight of the splintered bone. Next came the poultice. She took dried yarrow from her bag, what the old healers called woundwort, and crushed it with a smooth stone, mixing it with a little water to form a thick green paste. To this, she added powdered willow bark for the pain and fever. The earthy medicinal scent filled the air. She applied the paste directly to the wound, covering the entire inflamed area. Kaya's skin was frighteningly hot to the touch. As she worked, she noticed the other injuries. Kaya's breathing was still shallow and wet. Lydia pressed gently on her ribs, earning a deep groan. Broken ribs at least 2. Possibly a punctured lung. There was nothing she could do for that out here but pray. She bound the leg tightly with clean linen, sandwiching it between 2 flat pieces of driftwood she found in the wash to act as a rudimentary splint. The work was physically and emotionally draining. The sun began to dip towards the canyon rim, painting the red rocks in hues of orange and purple. Only when Kaya was stabilized as best as she could be did Lydia turn her attention to Nita. The gash on her face was deep, but it had stopped bleeding. The real danger was the fever. Nita was shivering despite the heat, a sure sign of infection and shock. "You need to drink," Lydia said, holding out her canteen. Nita stared at it as if it were a coiled snake. Lydia sighed. She took a small sip herself to show it wasn't poisoned, then offered it again. Hesitantly, Nita reached out a trembling hand and drank her throat, working convulsively. Lydia then prepared a simpler poultice for the cut and a tea from the willow bark. She built a small, smokeless fire using dry brush heating water in a small tin cup she carried. She offered the steaming cup to Nita, who drank it greedily. For hours they sat in silence as darkness fell. The canyon grew cold, and the stars emerged a brilliant, indifferent blanket overhead. Lydia tended the fire periodically, checking on Kaya, using a damp cloth to cool her feverish skin. Nita watched her initial hostility, replaced by a weary, watchful curiosity. She saw the genuine concern in the small white woman's face, the skilled and gentle way her hands worked, the exhaustion that was beginning to pull at the corners of her eyes. This was not the enemy she had been taught to expect. Sometime deep in the night, Kaya began to thrash, muttering in her own tongue, her body racked with fevered nightmares. Nita started trying to comfort her, but her own weakness was overwhelming. Lydia moved to Kaya's side, dipping a cloth in the now cool willow bark tea and placing it on her forehead. She began to hum a low, tuneless melody her mother used to sing to her when she was sick. It was a simple, soothing sound, a thread of pure compassion in the vast, dangerous wilderness. Nita's hand, which had been resting on her knife, slowly relaxed. She watched Lydia tend to her sister, a stranger, performing an act of profound intimacy and care that should have been Nita's alone. She saw the bone-deep weariness in Lydia's posture and understood that this woman had chosen to stay here in the dark, in enemy territory, to keep watch over two people who could have killed her without a second thought. A debt was being formed. It was not a debt of coin or goods, but something far older and more profound. It was a debt written in blood and herbs, in shared vulnerability, under a canopy of silent stars. And in the heart of the Apache warrior, a fragile, tentative trust began to take root in the barren soil of her prejudice. She didn't know the white woman's name, but she knew the character of her spirit, and that she was beginning to realize was more important. Lydia did not return to Redemption Gulch that night, nor the next day. For 2 full days and nights, she remained in the canyon, a solitary guardian. She depleted her entire stock of yarrow and willow bark. She ventured further into the wash to find more water, her ears always straining for the sound of a rattlesnake or the padded footfalls of a predator. Nita, weak but lucid, helped as much as she could, her strong hands surprisingly deft at grinding herbs under Lydia's direction. Communication was a clumsy dance of gestures and single words. Water, pain, sleep. Yet a bond formed in that shared struggle. Lydia learned their names, repeating them, until Nita gave a faint smile of approval. Nita, in turn, learned Lydia's name, her tongue struggling with the foreign sounds. By the morning of the 3rd day, the crisis had passed. Kaya's fever had broken. The angry redness around her wound had subsided, and her breathing was easier. She was awake, her eyes clear, though she was too weak to speak. Nita's own strength was returning. The gash on her face was beginning to heal cleanly. They had survived. Lydia, bone-tired and running on fumes, knew she couldn't stay any longer. Her absence would be noticed. "I have to go," she told Nita, pointing back in the direction of the town. "Redemption Gulch." Nita understood. She gripped Lydia's forearm, her calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. Her dark eyes held a depth of gratitude that needed no words. It was a promise, an acknowledgement of the debt. Lydia simply nodded, and with one last look at the two sisters, she began the long walk back. She arrived at the edge of town looking like a wraith. Her clothes were torn and stained with blood and dirt, her face was gaunt with exhaustion, and her hair was a tangled mess. Her entrance did not go unnoticed. Mrs. Hemlock, the town's self-appointed moral compass and chief purveyor of gossip, saw her from the porch of the general store. Her eyes widened, and she immediately scurried off, no doubt, to alert the sheriff. By the time Lydia reached her shack, Sheriff Barton was waiting for her, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his barrel chest. He was a big man, gone to seed, with a drooping mustache that failed to hide the permanent sneer on his face. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice like gravel grinding. "Look what the coyote dragged in. You've been gone 3 days, Mayhew. Some folks were starting to hope you'd finally kicked the bucket out there." Lydia ignored the jibe, her body screaming for rest. "I was gathering herbs, Sheriff." "Is that what they're calling it now?" Barton pushed himself off the doorframe, his shadow falling over her. "Mrs. Hemlock saw you come from the direction of the Sunstone Canyons. That's Apache territory. You know the law. No Congress with the hostiles." "I saw no one." Lydia lied, her voice flat. It was a weak lie, and she knew it. Her disheveled state told a different story. Barton's eyes narrowed, taking in the bloodstains on her skirt. "That right? You look like you've been through a war. You can sort in with them, Mayhew trade in your little potions for something else." His insinuation was vile and unmistakable. Lydia's exhaustion gave way to a spike of anger. "I trade with no one but the people in this town who come slinking to my door when they're in pain. Now, if you'll excuse me." She tried to push past him, but he blocked her way, his hand clamping down on her shoulder. "You listen to me, girl. There's been talk. Folks are spooked. The Apache have been quiet for too long. Too quiet. If you're out there stirring up trouble, that trouble is going to visit all of us. You bring them down on this town, and I'll see you swing from a rope myself. You understand me?" His threat hung in the air, heavy and real. Lydia's defiance crumbled, replaced by the familiar, cold dread. She was an outcast. She had no one to defend her. Her word meant nothing against the sheriffs. She simply nodded, her eyes downcast. He grunted, seemingly satisfied, and released her. "You stay put. Don't you go wandering off again. I'll be watching you." He turned and stomped off, leaving Lydia alone with her fear. The next day, the town's mood was a palpable entity. It was a suffocating blanket of suspicion and hostility, all directed at her. When she walked to the well to draw water, conversations ceased. People turned their backs. Children who normally paid her no mind were quickly pulled away by their mothers, as if she were carrying the plague. Mrs. Hemlock stood on the mercantile porch, whispering to a group of women, her sharp gaze following Lydia like a hawk's. Lydia felt the invisible walls of her isolation closing in. She had done a good thing. She had saved 2 lives. But in this world, that act of compassion was seen as treason. She was a traitor who had aided the enemy. The storm that was gathering had nothing to do with the clouds that were beginning to build over the distant mountains. It was a storm of fear, ignorance, and hatred, and Lydia Mayhew was standing directly in its path. She sat in her small, silent shack, the scent of herbs offering little comfort, and wondered if her decision in the canyon had not only saved the 2 sisters, but had also just signed her own death warrant. The whispers were growing louder, the threats more tangible. The entire town was now a tinderbox, and Sheriff Barton was holding the match. All it would take was a single spark. The spark came the following morning. It arrived not as a flame, but as a rider. Lydia was outside tending to her small, struggling garden of medicinal plants when she felt it, first a low, rhythmic vibration in the hard-packed earth. It was the sound of many horses moving at a steady, deliberate pace. Her head snapped up her eyes, scanning the horizon. The people in the main street of Redemption Gulch heard it too. Doors opened, and faces pale with apprehension appeared in windows. They came over the rise, silhouetted against the bright morning sun. Not a war party, not a band of raiders, but a formal procession. There were at least 30 riders, all Apache, all mounted on strong, proud ponies. They moved with a disciplined silence that was far more intimidating than any war cry. Their faces were grim, their eyes fixed forward. At their head rode a man who commanded attention even from a distance. He was older than the others, his long black hair streaked with silver and tied back with a simple leather cord. He sat straighter in his saddle than any man Lydia had ever seen, a figure of immense authority and power. He wore no war paint, only the stern, unyielding expression of a king. This was Chief Blackwood. Lydia didn't need to be told, she knew it in her bones. And riding on either side of him, on ponies, led by other warriors, were Nita and Kaya. Nita sat tall, the gash on her face, a stark, healing line. Kaya was propped up, her splintered leg resting carefully, but she was alive. She was here. Panic erupted in Redemption Gulch. It was a frantic, clumsy ballet of chaos. Men scrambled for their rifles. Women screamed and herded their children indoors. The saloon doors swung shut. In seconds, the bustling street was deserted, replaced by the glint of rifle barrels poking from behind curtains and water barrels. Sheriff Barton appeared on the street, his shotgun held at his side. He was trying to project an image of authority, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. He stood alone in the middle of the dusty road, a pathetic, blustering fool facing down a force of nature. The Apache procession did not stop. They rode into town as if they owned it, their ponies' hooves kicking up dust that settled on everything, a fine red powder of quiet dominance. They ignored the hidden rifle barrels, the terrified faces, the lone lawman. Their destination was clear. They rode directly towards the outcast's shack on the edge of town. They rode directly towards Lydia. Lydia was frozen in place, her gardening trowel falling from her nerveless fingers. Her heart was a wild bird trapped in her chest. This was it. This was the trouble Barton had warned her about. They had come for her. Had Nita and Kaya told them she was the one who had helped, or had they, in their fever, believed she had harmed them? Was this a gesture of thanks or an execution squad? The riders formed a silent semicircle around her small property, effectively cutting her off from the town. The townsfolk who had scorned and isolated her were now her silent, terrified audience. Chief Blackwood halted his horse directly in front of her. He dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his age. Nita and Kaya were gently helped from their ponies, and they stood leaning on warriors for support, their eyes fixed on Lydia. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the wind whistling through the ill-fitting boards of Lydia's shack and the nervous stamping of the horses. The chief's eyes, dark and penetrating, swept over Lydia, taking in her slight frame, her faded dress, her calloused hands. He looked at her humble home, the hanging herbs, the small, meticulously tended garden. His gaze was not hostile, but it was intensely analytical, as if he were measuring her very soul. Finally he spoke. His voice was deep and resonant, carrying easily in the stillness. He did not speak in his own tongue, but in clear, heavily accented English, a fact that sent a fresh wave of shock through the hidden watchers of the town. "You are Lydia Mayhew." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Lydia found her voice, though it was a thin, reedy thing. "I am." The chief looked from her to his two daughters. Lydia risked a glance at them. Nita offered a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. Kaya gave a weak but genuine smile. Relief so potent it almost made her knees buckle, washed over her. "My daughters have told me what you have done," Chief Blackwood continued, his voice echoing in the silent street. "You found them broken and bleeding. You stayed with them. You used your knowledge to mend their bodies and drive back the fever. You gave them your water and your time. You did this knowing they were Apache, knowing that your own people would condemn you for it." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. Sheriff Barton had begun to creep forward, his shotgun held at the ready, but the cold, unified stare of 30 warriors stopped him in his tracks. "In our culture," the chief said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal, "a life saved creates a debt that cannot be ignored. You have saved not one but two, the daughters of a chief. This is a debt of blood, a debt of honor. It is the greatest debt a man can owe, and it must be repaid." Lydia swallowed hard, her mind racing. What could they offer her horse's furs? She wanted none of it. "There is no debt," she said quickly. "I only did what anyone would have done." A grim, mirthless smile touched the chief's lips. "No," he said, his gaze sweeping over the shuttered windows of the town. "Not anyone." He turned, and a warrior brought forward a long ceremonial staff adorned with eagle feathers. He took it and strode a few paces into the dusty ground between Lydia's shack and the main town. He raised the staff high, and the eyes of every person, Apache and white, were fixed upon him. "We have no gold, no silver that your people covet," he boomed, his voice now projecting for all to hear. "Our wealth is the land, the sky, the water. We pay our debts with that which gives life." He then did something that defied all logic, all expectation. He drove the base of the staff deep into the parched earth, not 10 yards from Lydia's front door. "This debt will now be paid," Chief Blackwood declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "The laws of my people are ancient and unbreakable. For saving the blood of my blood, we, the Apache people of this territory, hereby cede ownership of the lifeblood of this valley. From this day forward, the Whispering Creek and all the land, for 50 paces on either side of it, from the spring in the high rocks to the place where it vanishes into the sand, is no longer the property of your town. It is no longer Apache land. It is hers." He turned his hand, pointing not with a finger, but with his entire being, directly at the stunned, trembling figure of Lydia Mayhew. "The water," he pronounced, his voice dropping to a deadly serious tone, "now belongs to her. The debt is paid." For a full minute after Chief Blackwood's proclamation, a profound, absolute silence gripped Redemption Gulch. It was a silence born of pure, unadulterated shock. The townsfolk, hidden behind their walls, couldn't have been more stunned if the sky had cracked open and rained down frogs. The Whispering Creek wasn't just a stream. It was the town's singular, irreplaceable artery. It was the only source of fresh water for 100 miles in any direction. It watered their livestock, their meager crops, and filled the cups and buckets of every man, woman, and child. To control the creek was to hold the power of life and death over the entire town. And that power had just been handed to the town ghost, the hedge witch, Lydia Mayhew. Sheriff Barton was the first to find his voice. It came out as a strangled, incredulous laugh. "You're crazy. You can't just give away a river. That creek belongs to this town by settlement and by law." Chief Blackwood turned his head slowly, his eyes fixing on the sheriff with a look of cold contempt. "Your laws are written on paper. Ours are written in the earth and sealed in blood. She saved my daughters. We give her the water that gives life. To us the exchange is just." He turned back to Lydia, his expression softening, almost imperceptibly. "The gift is given. How you choose to wield its power is up to you." With that, he gave a sharp, guttural command. The Apache warriors moved as one. The two who had been supporting Kaya and Nita helped them back onto their ponies. Nita locked eyes with Lydia one last time, a complex look of gratitude, warning, and perhaps even pity. Then, as silently and suddenly as they had arrived, the entire procession turned and rode out of town, leaving behind a ceremonial staff stuck in the ground, a terrified populace, and one young woman who had just become the most powerful and hated person in the territory. The moment the last rider disappeared over the rise, the spell was broken. Doors flew open. The townspeople spilled out into the street, their shock curdling into a venomous rage. They didn't surge toward Lydia's shack at first. They gathered in a knot around Sheriff Barton, a buzzing hornet's nest of fury. "He can't do that! Can he, Sheriff?" cried Mr. Gable, the store owner, his face pale and sweaty. "It's a trick, a savage's trick," shouted Mrs. Hemlock, her voice a shrill shriek. "She's in league with them. She planned this all along, the witch." The word witch caught fire, spreading through the crowd like a prairie blaze. All their fear, their prejudice, their hatred for the Apache now had a convenient, vulnerable target. Lydia. She was the focal point of their terror. She was no longer just an outcast. She was a traitor, a conspirator who had somehow stolen their very existence from under their noses. Lydia stood frozen by her doorway, the angry shouts of the mob washing over her. She looked at the feathered staff, piercing the earth, a symbol of a gift that felt more like a curse. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't wanted this. She had wanted only to be left alone. Now she was the unwilling queen of a kingdom she couldn't control, ruling over subjects who wanted her dead. Sheriff Barton, seeing his authority crumbling and needing to reassert his dominance, raised his hands. "Everyone calm down," he roared, his voice laced with a false confidence. "It's just the word of a savage. It means nothing. We'll pull that stick out of the ground and go about our business." He strode purposefully toward the staff, but as he reached for it, a voice calm and clear cut through the din. "I wouldn't do that." All eyes turned. Lydia had taken 2 steps forward, her chin held high. The timid, overlooked girl was gone. In her place was someone else, someone forged in the crucible of the last few days. Her voice didn't tremble. Barton paused, his hand hovering over the staff. "And why not Mayhew?" he sneered. "You think this feather stick has some kind of magic?" "No," Lydia said, her gaze steady. "But Chief Blackwood does. You saw his warriors. Do you think he made that declaration? For show, he paid a debt according to his laws. If you defy that, if you disrespect the payment, you are not just insulting him, you are invalidating the debt. You are telling him that his daughters' lives are worthless. What do you think he will do then?" Her words struck a chord of primal fear in the crowd. They had seen the warriors. They had felt the cold, disciplined power they possessed. They knew Lydia was right. To defy the gift was to invite a war they could not possibly win. 30 warriors had been a formal escort. A war party would be 10 times that size. Redemption Gulch would be a smoking pyre before the cavalry even knew they were in trouble. Barton's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He was trapped. He couldn't attack Lydia without risking the wrath of the Apache, and he couldn't accept the situation without losing face and control over the town. The crowd murmured their anger, now mixed with a terrifying realization. They were hostages, and their jailer was the girl they had spent a decade tormenting. Lydia looked at their faces, faces twisted with hatred, fear, and a dawning, unwilling dependence. She saw Mrs. Hemlock, who had called her a witch, now looking at her as if she truly could cast a spell. She saw Mr. Gable, who had paid her in near-rotten vegetables, now calculating the cost of a cup of water. The weight of the gift, the weight of the river settled on her shoulders. It was heavier than any rock, colder than any winter night. The chief had said the power was hers to wield. As she stood there, facing the snarling mob that was her town, she had no idea if this power would be her salvation or her execution. All she knew was that the ghost of Redemption Gulch was gone, and in her place stood a woman who controlled the water, the town's very life, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The standoff lasted for 2 days. It was a silent, suffocating war of attrition. Lydia remained in her shack, and the town remained in its state of suspended, impotent rage. A grim parody of normalcy settled over Redemption Gulch. People still went about their chores, but a new, anxious ritual was added. Twice a day, a procession of townspeople led by a reluctant Sheriff Barton would walk to the boundary line marked by the Apache staff, carrying their empty buckets. Lydia would emerge from her shack. She would say nothing. She would simply stand by the staff, her presence a clear and undeniable statement of ownership. They would stop, stare at her with a mixture of hatred and desperation, and then, one by one, they would proceed to the creek to fill their buckets. They took only what they needed, their movements furtive, as if they were stealing from her, which, in their eyes, they were. Each bucket of water was a fresh humiliation. For Lydia, it was a waking nightmare. She had the power, but she didn't know what to do with it. She let them take the water, of course. She had no intention of letting people or their animals die of thirst. But she could feel the pressure building. The town's resentment was a living thing, growing stronger with every passing hour. Sheriff Barton in particular was becoming unhinged. His authority had been publicly neutered, and he was a man who defined himself by power. The breaking point came on the evening of the second day. A town meeting was held in the saloon. Lydia from her shack could hear the angry, drunken shouts carrying on the night air. She could make out Barton's voice, louder than the rest, slurring his words, but clear in his intent. He was whipping them into a frenzy, preying on their fears, stoking their hatred. He was painting her as a demon, an Apache collaborator who would bleed them dry or poison their water while they slept. He was turning their humiliation into a righteous call for violence. Lydia knew what was coming. She barred her flimsy door and sat in the dark, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had a small axe for chopping firewood, but it would be useless against a mob. She was trapped. The saloon doors burst open shortly after midnight. A group of about 15 men, their courage fortified by whiskey, emerged into the moonlight. They were armed with rifles, shotguns, and farming implements. At their head was Sheriff Barton, his face flushed, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and his shotgun in the other. "No more!" he roared, his voice echoing through the silent town. "We're not going to be held hostage by some hedge witch and her savage friends. That water is ours. This town is ours. We're taking it back." The mob roared its approval and began to march towards her shack, their intent clear and murderous. Lydia's blood ran cold. She scrambled to the back window, her mind racing. She could try to run into the darkness, but they would hunt her down. This was it. This was how she would die, torn apart by the very people she had lived alongside her entire life. Just as the first men reached the Apache staff and kicked it over, a new sound cut through the night. It wasn't the sound of horses. It was the whisper of an arrow fletched with black and white feathers, sliced through the air and embedded itself deep into the door of Lydia's shack, inches from where a man was about to smash it with a sledgehammer. It quivered there, a deadly silent warning. The mob froze. Every head turned towards the source of the arrow, the rocky outcrops that overlooked the town. There, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, stood 2 figures. Even at a distance, their size was unmistakable. Nita and Kaya. Nita held a bow, another arrow already nocked. Kaya, leaning on a makeshift crutch, had a rifle leveled, its long barrel glinting in the pale light. They were no longer victims. They were warriors, sentinels guarding their protector. Barton stared, his drunken bravado evaporating. "It's just 2 of 'em," he yelled, trying to rally his men. "We can take 'em." He raised his shotgun towards the rocks, but before he could fire, another arrow flew. This one was not a warning. It struck the whiskey bottle in his hand, shattering it and spraying him with cheap liquor. The message was clear, the next one would not miss. A low guttural cry echoed from the hills to the east. It was answered by another from the west, and another. The sounds multiplied, a chorus of ghost-like calls that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The town was surrounded. Chief Blackwood hadn't just left his daughters to stand guard, he had left his warriors hidden, silent and watching. The gift had come with invisible guardians. The men in the mob looked at each other, their faces slick with sweat and fear. The drunken rage was gone, replaced by the sober realization of their foolishness. They were not facing a lone, helpless girl. They were facing the full unseen might of the Apache nation. They were hopelessly, catastrophically outmatched. One by one they began to back away. The sledgehammer was dropped with a thud. Rifles were lowered. Without another word, the mob dissolved its members, slinking back into the shadows from which they had come, leaving Sheriff Barton standing alone in the dusty street, soaked in whiskey, his authority shattered beyond repair. Lydia, watching through a crack in her wall, let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Her legs gave way, and she slid to the floor, her body trembling with the aftermath of terror. She had not been alone after all. The debt she was beginning to understand worked both ways. She had saved them, and now they had saved her. From the rocks above, 2 giant figures kept their silent moonlit vigil, ensuring that the siege of Whispering Creek was over. Dawn broke, painting the sky in soft shades of rose and grey. It brought with it a fragile, exhausted peace. The town was quiet, its streets empty, as if ashamed of the night's madness. On the rocks overlooking the town, Nita and Kaya were gone, having melted back into the wilderness as silently as they had appeared. The only remnants of the siege were the splintered whiskey bottle in the street and the arrow still embedded in Lydia's door. Lydia pulled it free. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood and the sharp stone point. It was a symbol of her salvation, but also a reminder of the chasm that still existed between the 2 worlds. The violence had been averted, but the underlying problem, the water, the ownership, the fear, remained. She couldn't live like this, a queen in a besieged castle guarded by unseen warriors while her subjects plotted her demise. It wasn't a life. It was an armed truce waiting to collapse. She knew what she had to do. It was a risk, perhaps the greatest one she had ever taken, but the alternative was a slow, festering death for the town and a life of fear for herself. She walked into the center of town carrying the arrow. She stopped at the public well, the hub of the community, and waited. It wasn't long before people began to emerge tentatively from their homes. They saw her standing there alone and unarmed, and they paused uncertain. Mrs. Hemlock watched from her porch, her face a mask of confusion. Mr. Gable stood in the doorway of his store, wringing his hands. Sheriff Barton was the last to appear. He looked haggard, his clothes disheveled, the stench of stale whiskey still clinging to him. He had lost control, and he knew it. He saw Lydia, and his face hardened, but there was no fire left in his eyes, only the dull embers of defeat. When a small crowd had gathered, Lydia spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it carried in the morning stillness. "The violence of last night solved nothing," she began. "It only showed us how close we are to destroying ourselves. This can't continue. I never asked for the creek. I never wanted power over any of you." She looked at their faces, seeing not a mob anymore, but individuals, husbands and wives, parents, people she had known her whole life, even if only from a distance. "The Apache gave me this gift," she continued, "to honor a debt. I cannot refuse it without dishonoring them and putting all of us in danger. But their way of thinking is not ours. They see a gift not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. And I will not abuse that responsibility." She held up the arrow. "This is a symbol of their power, but it is also a symbol of their restraint. They could have destroyed this town last night. They did not." She took a deep breath. "So here is my decision. The creek is mine. That is the law of the Apache, and we will respect it. But water is for all living things. It cannot be owned like a horse or a parcel of land. From this day forward, I will be the keeper of the creek, not its owner. Everyone in this town may come and take the water they need for their homes, for their livestock, for their children, freely and without price." A murmur of disbelief went through the crowd, but she added, her voice hardening slightly as she looked directly at Sheriff Barton. "This arrangement is built on respect. There will be rules. No one will waste the water. No one will foul it. It will be shared and it will be protected. This land is harsh. The water is precious. We will treat it as such." She then turned her gaze towards the Sunstone Canyons, "and the Apache will have access to it as well. When they pass through this territory, they will be allowed to water their horses and fill their skins. This creek will no longer be a border between us, but a place where we can meet in peace. It will be a bridge, not a wall." It was a shocking proposal, a radical vision of coexistence in a land defined by conflict. She was not giving the creek back. She was changing its very definition. It was no longer a resource to be possessed, but a shared trust to be managed. Sheriff Barton scoffed a last gasp of his broken authority. "You expect us to share our water with them?" Before anyone could agree with him, Mr. Gable, the store owner, stepped forward. "She's right, Barton," he said, his voice surprisingly firm. "She's offering us our lives back. She holds all the cards, and she's not asking for a single cent. She's asking for decency. I reckon that's a bargain." Mrs. Hemlock, for the first time in her life, said nothing, merely staring at Lydia with a look of dawning grudging respect. In that moment, the power shifted for good. It flowed away from Barton's brand of fear and bullying and coalesced around Lydia's quiet strength and wisdom. In the weeks and months that followed, a new rhythm established itself in Redemption Gulch. Lydia became the keeper of the creek. She oversaw its use, ensuring fairness. The townsfolk, humbled and grateful, began to treat her not with scorn, but with a deference they had once reserved for the sheriff. They began to call her Miss Mayhew. They brought her gifts, real gifts this time, a new dress, fresh-bred tools for her garden. One afternoon, a small Apache party led by Nita appeared on the far side of the creek. The town watched tense, but Lydia walked down to the bank to meet them. They watered their horses, and Nita gave Lydia a beautifully woven basket. They spoke for a few minutes, in a mixture of English and gestures, two women from different worlds, bound by a shared past, standing on the bridge they had helped create. Lydia Mayhew never married. She never had children of her own. But she became the heart of Redemption Gulch. She was the healer, the mediator, the keeper of the peace. The story of the poor girl who was gifted a river became a local legend, a tale told to children about how courage was not about how fast you could draw a gun, but about the compassion you could find in your heart. The legacy of the outcast was not written in stone or gold, but in the clear, life-giving water that flowed freely for everyone, a lasting testament to a shocking decision that had brought not war, but a chance for a new beginning. The story of Lydia Mayhew reminds us that the true heroes of the West weren't always the ones with the fastest gun or the most gold. Sometimes they were the quiet souls, the outcasts, the people who chose compassion in a world that rewarded cruelty. Lydia's journey from a reviled hedge witch to the respected heart of her community shows us that one person's courage, one act of kindness, can be more powerful than a drunken mob or a sheriff's badge. She didn't just save 2 lives, she saved an entire town from its own hatred and fear, transforming a symbol of division into a source of unity. She proves that true strength isn't about owning and controlling things, but about wisely and generously sharing them. If this story of unlikely courage and the enduring power of compassion resonated with you, please take a moment to give this video a like. Share it with someone who appreciates a story with a real heart. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tales from the untamed West that you won't find in the history books. Thank you for listening.